The papers landed back on the king's desk at exactly 10:17 that night, unsigned, unapproved, with 4 words written across the front in William's own handwriting. "I won't be used." Charles stared at them. Nobody moved. Not the private secretary beside the fireplace, not the lawyer clutching the duplicate copy, not even Edward, who had been standing near the window so quietly that Charles had almost forgotten he was there. Almost. Because Edward was the reason those papers existed. They were supposed to remove him from a royal estate he had been told would remain in his family for the rest of his life. William had been asked to approve the transfer. Instead, he had returned everything. But that wasn't the moment the room changed. That happened when Edward stepped forward, placed a thin black envelope beside the rejected papers, and said something Charles clearly wasn't expecting. William couldn't approve it, even if he wanted to. Charles looked up. Edward didn't blink. Neither can you. Now hold on. A reigning king being told he didn't have the final say inside his own family? That should have been impossible. But Edward wasn't challenging the crown. He was revealing that somebody else had already challenged it years earlier. Somebody Charles could no longer argue with. To understand why William returned those papers, you have to go back 72 hours to the letter Edward received just after breakfast. It wasn't delivered by an ordinary courier. A senior palace official brought it personally. That detail mattered. Officials don't travel across the country to deliver good news. They travel when the palace wants to see your face as you read it. Edward opened the envelope at the dining room table. Sophie was sitting opposite him. The first page looked harmless. Formal language, polite phrases, references to future planning, and the efficient administration of private royal residences. Then Edward reached the 4th paragraph. His expression changed. He was being given 30 days to surrender control of Ravensmere House. Not 6 months, not a year, 30 days. Ravensmere wasn't one of the great public palaces. Tourists didn't queue outside its gates. Cameras didn't wait along its drive. That was precisely why it mattered. The late Queen had used the estate privately for decades. Family lunches, quiet meetings, weekends without photographers, conversations that never entered the court circular. After her death, Edward had continued looking after it, not as a grand palace, as a promise. But according to the letter in his hands, that promise had suddenly become an informal arrangement. Edward read the sentence twice. Sophie reached for the pages. What are they saying? Edward didn't answer immediately. He turned to the final sheet. There it was. The estate would be transferred into a new administrative structure connected to William's household. That was the clever part. Charles's name barely appeared. William's name was everywhere. It made the removal look like preparation for the future rather than punishment in the present. But Edward noticed something the officials had hoped he wouldn't. The transfer required William's written acceptance. No signature from William, no transfer. Edward closed the file. Then he asked the official one question. Has the Prince of Wales seen this? The official hesitated, only for half a second. But half a second is an eternity when someone is deciding whether to lie. The prince's office has been informed. Edward looked at him. That isn't what I asked. The official gathered his coat and left without answering, and that silence gave Edward the first thing he needed. Suspicion. But suspicion wasn't enough, not against palace lawyers, not against a document carrying the authority of the king's private office. Edward needed William to see the papers before anyone coached him on how to read them. So he made one call. William didn't answer. Edward called again. Still nothing. Then, instead of leaving a long message, Edward said only 9 words. Don't sign anything carrying the silver crest. Call me. That message reached William during a reception at St. James's Palace. He listened to it once, then again. The silver crest referred to the king's private estate office, a department William almost never dealt with directly. Yet a folder from that office was already waiting in his car. That was no coincidence. William canceled his next engagement. Not publicly, not dramatically. He simply walked out through a side entrance, entered the car, and opened the folder before the driver had even pulled away. The first pages appeared routine. Then he found Edward's name. Then Ravensmere. Then the clause requiring William to accept future custodial responsibility. Custodial responsibility. A beautiful phrase. It sounded like William was being trusted. In reality, he was being asked to take something from his uncle. But William still didn't know the worst part. Not yet. He turned to the schedule of assets attached at the back. The estate itself, the surrounding woodland, several cottages, a private archive room. Then one line had been covered with correction tape and photocopied again. William held the page toward the window. Beneath the white strip, he could just make out part of the original sentence. Subject to the consent of the protector. Protector? There was no protector listed anywhere in the new documents. No name, no signature line, nothing. Someone had removed the clause, but left its shadow behind. William called Edward immediately. "What is Ravensmere?" Edward's answer came quietly. "It's not the house you should be asking about." William stared at the altered page. "What should I be asking about? Why they need your signature so badly?" Then Edward ended the call. That should have annoyed William. Instead, it frightened him. Because Edward wasn't begging him to refuse. He was telling him the documents were already defective. William took the folder to Kensington Palace and locked himself inside his study with 2 advisors. Not palace advisors, his advisors. That distinction was becoming more important by the minute. They compared the new papers with older estate records. Most of the language matched, but several dates didn't. One agreement was supposedly drafted 9 weeks after the Queen's death. The document identification number, however, belonged to a series created almost a year earlier. Wait, what? The transfer hadn't begun after the Queen died. Someone had prepared for it while she was still alive. William's lawyer spotted another problem. The new papers described Edward as a temporary occupant. When the fighting ended, millions were dead, but an older financial statement referred to Ravensmere as a protected family settlement. Temporary occupancy could be canceled. A protected settlement was something else entirely. William asked the obvious question. Protected by whom? Nobody knew. The relevant page was missing from the palace copy. Not torn out. Missing. As though it had never been filed. That was when William understood the trap. If he signed, the transfer would look voluntary. Charles could say the estate had passed naturally to the next generation. Edward would look bitter if he objected. William would look greedy if the hidden documents ever emerged. One signature would divide 3 brothers without Charles ever having to raise his voice. But who had designed it that way? Before William could find out, Charles called. Not an aide, Charles himself. "I understand you have the papers." William looked at the folder on his desk. "I do. I'd like them completed tonight. No greeting, no explanation, just completed." William asked whether Edward had agreed to leave Ravensmere. Charles paused. "Edward understands that arrangements change." That wasn't an answer. William pressed harder. "Does he agree?" Another pause. Then Charles said, "This is not about Edward." William looked at Edward's name printed across 11 different pages. Then why is he the only person losing anything? Silence. Not angry silence. Worse. The kind that tells you the other person never expected resistance. Charles finally said, "You will inherit responsibilities that cannot be postponed forever." There it was. Duty. The one word William had been trained never to argue with. But this time, duty was wearing someone else's fingerprints. William asked about the protector clause. The line went quiet. Then Charles said, "There is no active protector." Active. Not non-existent. Active. William caught it immediately. You know who it is. Charles ended the call. And that gave William his answer. Someone did have the final say. Charles simply believed that person could no longer use it. By sunset, rumors had started moving through the palace. Edward was refusing to cooperate. Sophie was furious. William had been offered a major private estate. None of those rumors mentioned the missing clause. That wasn't accidental. The palace wanted the argument to look emotional before it became legal. Edward was cast as the resentful younger brother. William was cast as the impatient heir. Charles remained above the conflict, supposedly forced to bring order. But Edward didn't defend himself. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't call journalists. He drove to Windsor and asked for access to a room that had been sealed since the Queen's death. The request was refused. Edward asked again. Refused. Then he produced a handwritten authorization bearing the late Queen's signature. The room was opened 11 minutes later. Inside stood 3 locked document cabinets, a writing desk, and a red dispatch box that palace officials believed was empty. It wasn't. Edward removed 1 black envelope. Nothing else. He didn't even open it. That's the part that should tell you he already knew what was inside. The following morning, William received a revised version of the transfer agreement. The protector clause had disappeared completely. So had the reference to the private archive room. But one new paragraph had been added. It stated that William's signature would confirm that he had reviewed all relevant historic agreements. He hadn't. He had been denied them. They weren't asking him to accept an estate anymore. They were asking him to certify that no hidden agreement existed. That was the moment William stopped investigating quietly. He returned every page to the king's office, but he didn't send them with an aide. He carried them himself. Charles was meeting with 2 lawyers when William entered. Edward had not yet arrived. William placed the folder on the desk. Charles looked at the handwritten words across the cover. I won't be used. You've misunderstood the purpose of these documents, Charles said. William remained standing. No, I understand it now. Charles's jaw tightened. This estate will eventually fall under your responsibility. Not if it was never yours to give me. One of the lawyers interrupted. Your Royal Highness, there is no legal obstacle to the proposed transfer. William turned toward him. Then why did you remove the obstacle from the second draft? Nobody answered. Charles dismissed the lawyers. They packed their papers too quickly. That was another mistake. One loose sheet slipped from the table and landed near William's foot. It was a note from the estate office. Only one sentence was visible. If challenged, rely upon the sovereign's power of revocation. William picked it up. Charles held out his hand. William didn't give it back. Revocation of what? Charles looked exhausted now. Not defeated. Cornered. The Queen made several private arrangements near the end of her life. For Edward? For the family. William stepped closer. Then why is Edward being removed? Charles's response was colder than William expected. Because my mother made promises without considering what they would cost the next reign. There it was. The real grievance. Not the house. Not efficiency. Control. The Queen had made a decision that continued after her death, and Charles had spent months trying to pull it back into his own hands. But he had missed one person. The door opened. Edward walked in, carrying the black envelope. He looked at William's returned papers, then at Charles. You went ahead without the consent. Charles didn't ask what he meant. That was the second confirmation. He already knew. Edward placed the envelope on the desk. Charles stared at the seal. It was the late Queen's personal seal, not the monarch's official seal. A family decision, not an act of state, which made what happened next even more brutal. Charles said, That document has no authority over the sovereign. Edward nodded. Correct. William looked at him. Edward continued. It has authority over the trustees. Charles's expression changed. Just slightly. But William saw it. The estate had never been left directly to Edward. It had been placed into a private trust. That meant Charles couldn't simply revoke it as king, but surely he could replace the trustees. Edward answered that before William even asked. You tried to remove them in February. Charles said nothing. They refused, Edward continued, so you attempted to transfer the estate through William instead. William looked from Edward to his father. Now the missing pieces were locking together. Charles couldn't take Ravensmere directly. He needed Edward to appear temporary. He needed William to appear willing. Most importantly, he needed the mysterious protector to remain silent. Charles leaned back in his chair. The protector's role ended with the Queen's death. Edward finally opened the black envelope. No, it began with it. Inside was a single folded document and a smaller sealed note. Edward handed the document to William. The first page established the trust. The second listed the assets. The third described Edward's rights. But the fourth page contained the name everyone had been hiding. William read it once, then looked toward the door. Charles whispered, "She won't involve herself." Edward almost smiled. "She already has." The door opened again. Princess Anne entered without an aide, without a folder, without the slightest trace of hesitation. She didn't look at Edward first. She looked at Charles. That told William everything. Anne was the protector. Not William, not Charles, Anne. The Queen had chosen the only one of her children who received no personal benefit from the trust. Anne couldn't inherit Ravensmere. She couldn't sell it. She couldn't live there. Her only power was to stop anyone else from breaking the arrangement. Charles stood. This is a private matter between the sovereign and his son. Anne removed her gloves. No, it became my matter when you attempted to alter Mummy's settlement. Charles flinched at the word mummy. Not because it was childish, because it stripped away the crown. For 1 second, he wasn't the king facing subjects. He was an older brother being confronted by the sister who knew exactly what their mother had feared. William looked at Anne. Did you know about the transfer? I knew they would try something. They, not he. Anne wasn't blaming Charles alone. Someone inside his household had designed the documents, removed the clauses, changed the language, then placed William's name at the center. But Anne still hadn't delivered the biggest blow. Edward pointed toward the smaller sealed note. Charles said, "There is no need to read that." Anne answered immediately, "There is every need." Edward broke the seal. The note was written in the Queen's hand. Not legal language, no ceremonial phrasing, just a direct instruction. If any future sovereign attempted to revoke the settlement, the protector was required to confirm Edward's rights permanently and transfer the complete private archive into his custody. Charles stared at the note. William finally understood why the archive room had vanished from the revised papers. Ravensmere wasn't hiding money. It was hiding history, letters, private diaries, records of meetings, promises made inside the family that never appeared in official documents. Edward hadn't inherited a pile of embarrassing secrets to release for revenge. He had inherited responsibility for protecting them. But Charles's attempt to remove him had triggered the one clause Charles feared most. The archive could no longer remain under the king's control. Anne had already signed the confirmation that morning. The transfer was complete. Irrevocable. Charles turned toward her. "You did this without speaking to me?" Anne's face didn't change. "You were given 6 months to speak to Edward. He refused every reasonable compromise." Edward's voice stayed calm. "You offered me 12 months at Ravensmere in exchange for surrendering the archive." William looked at Charles. That offer had never appeared in any papers. Edward continued, "When I refused, your office rewrote me as an occupant." Charles struck the desk with the flat of his hand. Not hard, but hard enough to make the fountain pen roll toward the edge. This family cannot be governed by instructions from the dead. Anne caught the pen before it fell. Then she placed it beside the Queen's note. No, she said, but it can be judged by how it treats their promises. Nobody spoke, because now William saw the full shape of it. He hadn't been offered Ravensmere as a gift. He had been positioned as the instrument that would break the Queen's last protection around Edward. Had he signed, Edward would have lost the estate. Charles would have recovered the archive. William would have carried the blame. But by returning the papers, William hadn't only protected Edward. He had protected himself. And, in the most humiliating twist of all, he may have protected Charles too. Because the documents were never valid. If they had been filed, the trustees could have challenged them publicly. The altered clauses would have been examined. The hidden negotiations would have surfaced. A private family dispute would have become a legal spectacle involving the king, the Prince of Wales, two royal siblings, and the late Queen's secret instructions. William looked at the rejected folder. Who prepared the first draft? Charles didn't answer. Anne did. Someone who believed you'd sign before asking questions. That person remained unnamed. For now. But Edward knew. You could see it in the way he looked toward the empty chair beside Charles, the chair the king's private secretary had occupied before being dismissed. And that's when the story became bigger than a brother fighting for an estate. Someone had gambled that William's ambition would be stronger than his loyalty. Someone had gambled that Charles's frustration would be stronger than his caution. Someone had gambled that Edward would stay quiet because Edward had always stayed quiet. They were wrong about all three. Halfway through a story like this, you start realizing the person making the most noise rarely holds the real power. Subscribe if you enjoy watching the hidden detail turn an entire palace battle upside down, because Anne still hadn't revealed what she had done before entering that room. Charles looked at Edward. What do you intend to do with the archive? Edward folded the Queen's note carefully. What she asked me to do. That is not an answer. It's the only answer you were ever entitled to. William stepped between them before Charles could respond. What exactly did Edward inherit? Anne glanced at Edward. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not afraid. Emotional. Because Ravensmere wasn't the inheritance. Not really. The trust gave Edward the right to live there, but ownership would eventually pass elsewhere. The financial income was restricted to maintenance. The land couldn't be sold. Edward could never turn it into private wealth. So, why fight this hard? Anne opened the final page of the trust. The Queen had named Edward custodian of the family record. Every private document placed at Ravensmere during her lifetime came under his protection. But there was more. Edward had also inherited the authority to decide when those records could be shown to future members of the family, including William, including George one day. The Queen had not trusted the reigning monarch to control how family history was remembered. She had trusted Edward, the quiet son, the one nobody expected to challenge anyone. Charles finally understood the embarrassment. The Queen had left him the crown, but she had left Edward the power to preserve the truth behind it. William asked the question Charles clearly didn't want asked. Why him? Anne looked at Edward, then at the Queen's handwriting, because he never asked her for anything. That landed harder than any accusation. Charles turned away. Edward had spent his life being treated as the least consequential of the Queen's sons. Now that very quality had made him the safest one. He didn't inherit influence because he demanded it. He inherited it because he could be trusted not to use it for himself. But Anne's final move was still sitting inside her coat pocket. She removed a small cream card, the trustee's confirmation, signed by Anne, countersigned by two independent executors, dated 8:40 that morning, before William returned the papers. Before Charles summoned the lawyers, before Edward entered the room. The argument had been over all day. Charles simply hadn't been told. Anne placed the confirmation on top of the rejected transfer. The estate remains with Edward for his lifetime. The archive passes into his custody immediately. No disposal, relocation, or inspection can occur without his written consent. Charles read the card. Then he noticed one more line. The protector could not reverse the decision after confirmation. Not even Anne could change it now. Charles looked at her. You made it permanent. Anne put her gloves back on. No, Mummy did. I merely stopped you from pretending she hadn't. Edward picked up the black envelope. William left his rejected papers exactly where they were. Nobody shook hands. Nobody apologized. That would have made it too easy. Edward walked toward the door, but Charles called his name. For 1 second, it looked as though the king might say something human, something between brothers. Instead, he asked, "Will I be allowed to see the archive?" Edward stopped. He didn't turn around. Yes, Charles exhaled. Then Edward finished the sentence. When William becomes king, that was the real reversal. Charles had tried to use the future king to take Edward's inheritance. Now only the future king could open it. Edward left. Anne followed. William remained beside his father for a few seconds longer, staring at the altered papers that were supposed to make him more powerful. Then he took the loose note from the desk. If challenged, rely upon the sovereign's power of revocation. William tore it once, cleanly. He placed the 2 halves beside the Queen's fountain pen and walked out without another word. Charles was left alone with 3 documents. The transfer he couldn't enforce, the confirmation he couldn't reverse, and the handwritten promise his own mother had trusted Edward to protect from him. So tell me this. When William returned those papers, was he saving Edward's inheritance? Or was he saving his father from the moment the entire country discovered that the king had inherited the throne, but not the final say?